Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Jazakumullah khairan everyone for joining the webinar. But before I get into it, I want to just quickly go over some overall points of this presentation. Firstly, I want us to understand that the desire to own Kashmir is not a new objective for the current BJP government or their grassroots RSS supporters, but basically it's something that has been part of their goals since even the birth, even before the birth of India. So if you need an analogy to kind of help understand it further, you can liken it to how Zionists want to take over all of Palestine. It's the reason for their existence. It's something that is part of their core purpose. My intent is not to demoralize, but to give you guys a better understanding of our Muslim history. Because if you're in this webinar, then you do want to see a Kashmir that's free from oppression, and that means knowing our own wider Muslim history. And on top of that, there will be some points where we can take hope and motivation from the examples of the Kashmiris themselves. You know, they have not lost their sense of dignity and Muslim identity. And generally speaking, the sources for this presentation are based on human rights reports and minutes from UN meetings. Okay, so when I talk about Kashmir, I'm mainly talking about the region that is now controlled by India. When I'm talking about Kashmir in this presentation, there are also other parts of this region called Jammu, Ladakh, and Aksai Chin. It gets a bit confusing because these historical areas were then split between India, Pakistan, and China. But when I talk about Kashmir in this presentation, I'm talking about the Indian controlled region, although sometimes I will refer to specific areas as well. And this talk is split into 3 sections with 4 turning points. So basically, Islam arrives. Islam coming into Kashmir, and that's basically going to be about how social dynamics developed in the region. Indian independence, so that section is about how India verbally promised autonomy, but actually prepared on the ground for absorbing Kashmir. So, you know, their legal behavior versus their practical behavior, if that makes sense. The things they promised versus what they did. Yeah, that's what I mean. Article 370, so that section is about bringing the promise of autonomy into law, but also the laws and actions that would directly undermine Kashmiri autonomy. And I'm going to finish on the Shimla Agreement because that would become the foundation stone for the argument that Kashmir is an internal issue for India. And a point that I'd like you to keep in mind is that not all the information I'm presenting is on the slides. I don't really like giving walls of texts. I don't find that's very helpful for really absorbing information. So please do listen closely. And there will be a Q&A at the end after the recording. But at some points, you know, I'll have a pause for reflection. You can make some notes in the chat. Okay, so in 1339, Muslim Shah overthrows the Hindu Kotarani and Kashmir gradually becomes majority Muslim. In 1780, the Kingdom of Jammu is captured by Gulab Singh of the Sikh Empire, based in the Punjab. And Muslims, so this is the first major change in social dynamics because the Muslims of the region become the ruled rather than the rulers, and there's a major change in social dynamics. In 1819, Ranjit Singh conquers Kashmir for the Sikhs, and they enact anti-Muslim laws like banning the Adhan and banning Friday Jummah prayers, and they tax the Muslim peasants into poverty. So different governors would have different impacts on the Muslim population, and for example, under Bama Singh Ardali, sectarian riots broke out, and under Prince Sher Singh, he once took 7/9 or as tax from all traders, and he took it personally. Later on, he would be stripped of his post, but you know, by and large, the rulers of the region were given free rein to do as they willed. And sort of like as an example to show that there was, an underlying grumble of dissent, in 1830, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi tried to expand jihad against the Sikh Empire into Kashmir, and although he was defeated a year later, this is a clear example of dissent amongst the Muslims in the region. And in 1846, after the First Sikh War, the British East Indian Company wins Kashmir and sells it to the Hindu Gulab Singh for 7.5 million rupees. And that's basically the start of the Dogra rule of Jammu and Kashmir. To pay back the fee, the Dogra rulers would tax the Kashmiris heavily and use the peasants as forced labor. And this mentality would define the dynamics between the ruling class, whether they're Sikh or Hindu or sometimes even Muslim, and they're largely Muslim subjects all the way to the present day. And on the 3rd of June 1947, Indian leaders agree their country should split between Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India after independence, and Hari Singh, the Dogra prince of Jammu and Kashmir, delays committing to either side. Meanwhile, through August 1947, Kashmiri demonstrations demanding that they join Pakistan are put down. And this excerpt that I'm showing here is from a UN meeting in 1948 trying to resolve the situation. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that later. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there. There's a lot of information there to take in. What are the points that really stuck out to you guys? For me, what's quite clear is that Kashmir rulers, the rulers of Kashmir, they were used to ruling authoritatively. Like their rulers, don't really care for the opinion of the people except when they are forced to listen. And in modern Kashmir, we see Sikhs and Muslims and Buddhists and even Hindus who want India to stop occupying and oppressing the region because, they're Kashmiris working together to raise awareness. And 2 points that I touched on of demonstrations and preparations for separating. Now, I'm going to go into that in more detail in a later presentation, but something to take on board from this point is that Kashmiris were clearly organizing themselves in preparation for upcoming independence into a grouping called the National Conference, another grouping called the Muslim Conference, and so on. Because the National Conference's leadership, Sheikh Abdullah, was vocal at this time for One United India, reports written by the Indian government at this time favor them and put down other political parties like the Muslim Conference and other independence groups. There were several significant parties, but in the Indian government wanted to leverage their differences for their gain, not Kashmir's. So even from before the birth of India, Kashmiris are organizing themselves and making sure they've got a political voice. And even at this early stage, the Indian government is trying to leverage differences between Kashmiris for the central Indian government's gain, putting the Indian government over the benefit of the Kashmiris. Just keep that in mind. It's going to come up a lot. Okay, so the 15th of August 1947, India gains independence from Britain. And September 1947, Kashmir's Muslim Conference telegrams the Governor General of Pakistan asking for help against the Dogra oppression and killings. This is key because the who started it question is controversial to this day. And if you look at UN Council discussions from 1948, it's clear that Kashmiris were asking for Pakistan for help long before Pakistani tribal fighters came in. So, for example, on the 2nd of October 1947, civilian resistance to the Dogra state oppression came to a head, and in that one day, there was a daytime raid on a police station in Derkot, and then on the same night, there was a civilian raid led by Kashmiri civilians on a military post in Churiala, and the Dogra forces would retaliate by attacking homes, and this would escalate by the 17th of October. The Dogra army is expelling Muslims from Jammu province, and refugees would be sent to the West Punjab, which would later formally be part of Pakistan. And I'll go a bit more into the strategy behind the expulsions in Jammu in a bit. But on the 22nd of October, the First Kashmir War kicks off. Pakistani tribal militias crossed the border to aid the uprising in Poonch district. And on the 26th of October, the Dogra ruler decides to join India in exchange for military defense. So Article 370 is added to the drafted Indian constitution, protecting Kashmir's autonomy and promising a future referendum. This is key to determine Kashmir's independence. And once that has been agreed by the Dogra ruler, the Indian and Pakistani armies officially clash. I think it's important to note here that this is after the signing of this, it's when the armies have officially clashed, although there's plenty of accounts and so on from people who were living there at the time that the fighting obviously had started before that as well. 31st of October 1947, an emergency administration is set up to run Kashmir, headed by the Indian-leaning National Conference. So I mentioned them before. Support for the rival Pakistan-leaning Muslim Conference and other political parties is undermined using emergency laws. The 5th of November, Dogra forces expel more Muslims out of Jammu, driving them to Rajouri to execute them, and murders of Muslims would continue, committed by communal marauders aided by the RSS. So I mentioned them earlier. The RSS is the grassroots wing of the BJP, and the final death toll of Muslims killed would be over 200,000. Like you gotta realize the 60% Muslim population of Jammu through this act of expulsions and killings and so on. The 60% Muslim population of Jammu had now become a minority, and even today, in the 2000s, even today, they're 30% in Jammu, and that would swing any future referendum results in that particular province in India's favour. 25th of December, the Hindus and Sikhs of Jammu and those who had gone there from outside killed Muslims. The Maharaja of Kashmir is responsible for what is happening there. Muslim women have been dishonoured. And that is a quote, an admission of guilt from Mahatma Gandhi. It really doesn't get any blunter than that. And in January 1948, the Enemy Agents Ordinance is passed, creating a police state, enabling surveillance structures that involve police and the ruling National Conference establishment. So it would deny suspects the right to legal defense counsel and could lead to life imprisonment or execution. So basically, all of that put together, what does that mean? Modern Kashmir, what that means is that modern Kashmir has existed as a political entity for just 4 months, and already the first piece of authoritative legislation has been forced onto Kashmiris. It's just been 4 months that they've existed supposedly as an autonomous region in India, and already the political and the police establishments and systems are working together to create a system that crushes dissent. It just took 4 months for that to happen. 21st of April, UN Resolution 47 is adopted, which outlines a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir to decide which country to join. So just a little bit of explanation, the difference between a referendum and a plebiscite. So both of them, a referendum and a plebiscite, is where the people of a region vote on an issue. A referendum means that the vote is legally binding, the result is legally binding, and a plebiscite is the result is more of an advisory result than a legally binding result. So already there's been a step down from the referendum that was promised in Article 370. There's already been a step down to a plebiscite, and yet despite it being a step down, there has never been a plebiscite up to this day. There's never been a plebiscite. And well, why is that? Well, this quote from Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, kind of sums up why. He admits in a letter that the prize we are fighting for is the Valley of Kashmir. And that shows that there never was any will from India to let the Kashmiri people decide their own fate. Again, just a point to reflect on what we've taken in so far and what points have really stuck out. So please do make a note in the chat, and I will get through to any questions at the Q&A at the end. But yeah, by this point, it should be clear that modern India never intended to let go of Kashmir, never intended to give them any autonomy. And even before India's independence from Britain, there were attempts at undermining or just flattening Kashmiri autonomy. And also, if you look at words and actions, it's clear that demographics are being changed to alter the expected outcome in a future referendum. So what does that mean? Firstly, it means that we need to demand that referendum. It needs to be a legally binding referendum, but also it means that the future vote must include the diaspora, the people who have been kicked out or chased out or have had to leave out of fear of their safety. Their votes matter as well. Otherwise, this ethnic cleansing that is going on, this changing of demographics is going to impact the future vote, the future referendum. So keeping the diaspora involved in the referendum is key. Okay. 26th of January 1950, the Constitution order is adopted, formally bringing Article 370 into the finalized Indian Constitution. And yet, despite this gesture of fulfilling its promise, 26th of February 1950, the Preventative Detention Act is enacted, curbing political dissent. And basically, throughout the 50s and 60s, members of independent or pro-Pakistan political parties were banished or imprisoned. On the 8th of August 1953, Sheikh Abdullah, the first Prime Minister of Indian-controlled Kashmir, is imprisoned after telling a US diplomat that he wanted Kashmir to be independent. So think about the journey that this leader, that this one guy has gone through. At the start, he had talked about one united India, but the way the central Indian government treated Kashmiris became so bad that even he realized that independence from India was needed. But India had always been paranoid about Kashmiri independence, and they just cut this leader out who had previously shown so much loyalty. And to hammer this point home, the very next day, the 9th of August, the very next day, a new leader, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad, was put into power. And on top of this new leader, Bakshi Ghulam, he's given control of the so-called Peace Brigade, who are basically actually government-paid thugs who attack pro-independence leaders and activists and premises. So reflect on that. A Kashmiri leader who had previously been vocally loyal for years is locked up, and a day later he's replaced, and his replacement is given thugs to back him up and to beat down anyone who disagrees with Indian rule. 14th of May 1954, Article 35A is added to the Indian Constitution, which safeguards the rights of residency and ownership to existing residents, which should prevent India's only Muslim majority province from being theologically cleansed. And again, it sounds like India's doing something nice for Kashmir, but their repressive laws continue. Like in 1957, the president of pro-independence group Kashmir Political Conference is forcibly banished, and he would never be allowed to return, and he would die in exile. On top of that, 1958, India introduces the Foreigners Protected Areas Order, which limits or even bans entry of foreign journalists to certain areas. I mean, ask yourself, it's not a very difficult question, but ask yourself, why would India legislate such a thing? Why would India block foreign journalists from certain areas like Kashmir? It doesn't take much imagination to answer that. 1964, the peace brigades are closed down after a new state government takes over Indian-controlled Kashmir. And even though this specific group was gone, another would be set up, and it would become a feature of Kashmiri life for government-backed thugs to intimidate dissenters. 5th of August 1965, Operation Gibraltar is launched. Pakistan sends thousands of undercover forces into Kashmir. This was easily discovered and it led to the Second Kashmir War. Indian authorities would commit torture, reprisal attacks, and collective punishment of civilians. On the 15th of August 1965, the local war spills out to the rest of the Indo-Pakistan border as India forces Pakistan to divert its military from Kashmir. And Pakistan couldn't keep this pressure up for Kashmir, and on the 23rd of September 1965, a ceasefire was declared with a reversion to pre-war borders. So the 2nd of July 1971, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act is passed, replacing the Preventative Detention Act. And this would allow for indefinite detention, search and seizure without warrants, and wiretapping. So, and this would set up another trend where one piece of legislation, of emergency legislation that had a time limit on it, it would have a time limit on it, for the interests, so-called interests of democracy, for the sake of being transparent. But all they would do is just replace it with another one. And the next one might be even stricter than the old one. So again, playing with the facade of being democratic and with the facade of giving Kashmir autonomy. Okay, 17th of December 1971. In the Third Indo-Pakistan War, India gains some Kashmiri territory from Pakistan. Pakistan managed to negotiate it back, but in doing so, they came to an agreement that is still used as a fig leaf by Indian government today. And that agreement is the Simla Agreement. And it was signed on the 2nd of July 1972 between Pakistan and India. India would return its wartime gains in Kashmir to Pakistan, and they agreed that the new borders there are the final line of control. Both sides agreed to have a respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. So, overall, the agreement gives India a twofold advantage in Kashmir. So firstly, Pakistan had agreed to give up support for the Kashmir struggle. Secondly, that any future friction between the two countries is resolved bilaterally with no third-party involvement. And that's why this Shimla Agreement is often given as an excuse by Indian leaders that Kashmir is a bilateral issue. That means that it's an issue only between Pakistan and India, and it means that the UN or Britain or no other country can step in the middle to mediate. So before I go into my final conclusions, if you want to share any more of your thoughts in the chat. But the point that I really want to hone in on, something to notice in this period. Firstly, something to notice in this period is that Kashmiris tried repeatedly to fully engage democratically, and it was the authorities that would set the pattern to beat down dissent. It's a myth that Muslims or Kashmiris prefer violence over democracy. And this will become very clear in the next presentation, the death of politics, where I explain how exactly India pushed Kashmir into a brutal situation where violence was the only answer. And this would become very clear in the following years, particularly 1987 and 1989. And the next point, the overall conclusion that I hope you have all come to, is that India's oppression of Kashmir has always been there. Yeah, it's nothing new. The one thing that I hope you take away, if you only take away one thing from this presentation, is realizing that India has always been oppressing and coveting, desiring Kashmir. And if we leave the Kashmir issue as an internal affair, then India will only continue its oppression. It's been nearly 50 years since the Shimla Agreement was signed, and in that time, it's clear that India's treated Kashmir like an enemy country. They're not treating Kashmiris like equal citizens whose concerns can be expressed democratically. Kashmiris are being treated like an enemy within, inside their own motherland. And Kashmir is being treated as an enemy by India, so Kashmir needs allies. It's become an external affair by necessity. So, as Muslims, as an organization, as MPAC UK, we believe we have a duty to help Kashmir be free. So, what's next? Well, what are MPAC UK doing? We are doing this lecture series. We have made a timeline and a fact sheet of what's happened in Kashmir, and that this timeline is the basis. The information in the timeline is the basis for what I've been presenting to you guys today and in the rest of the series of webinars. And we are also building a campaign to intelligently and in a focused way boycott the BJP and its supporters and the other oppressors of Muslims and Kashmiris in India. We're also networking as an organization, we're networking with activists in the UK, in India, and elsewhere. What can you do as an individual? Well, if you like what we're doing and you can give your time and you're in Britain, please volunteer with us. The URL is bit.ly/MPACUK-volunteer. If you like what we're doing but you can't give the time, please try to donate. So mpacuk.org/donate. And if you don't have the time or the money, then please continue attending and promoting the rest of this series. Something that I would really appreciate everyone listening to this to do is to evaluate the webinar, and the link again is up on the screen. So bit.ly/evaluate-MPACUK-webinar, and that will help us improve our webinars over time, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan for listening, and going to pass on over to Imran for the Q&A.